Hello, everyone. Welcome to our social media podcast, project podcast episode. My name is Joshua, and I'm here with my partners.
My name's Jasnoor.
My name is Sebastian.
And I'm Zuhra.
This podcast is a part of our science communication course taught by Dr. Carin Bondar. Today, we have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Drewbrayshaw. He is an expert hydrologist and geoscientist who has been working around and studying water and landslides for more than 20 years. He is an expert in terrain stability assessment, natural hazard assessment, and many other facets of environmental geoscience throughout BC. And without further ado, I'm going to kick it off to my partner, Sebastian, to start us off.
Awesome. So if we're ready to dive in, we could just get started. What led you to start a career in climate science, Drew?
When I was an undergrad, I was doing an undergrad degree at UBC. I knew I wanted to be a scientist, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was interested in geology, geography, anthropology. I was kind of interested in archaeology and, tools and stuff like that, paleontology. I had a lot of interests. And I sat down with a graduate advisor and started being like, oh, I'm so interested in all this stuff. I don't know what to do. And he said to me, do you want to spend your whole life like underground in a mine? And I was like, no, I want to be outside, not like underground. And then they're like, okay, do you want to be like, hunched over, like digging with, a toothpick and a toothbrush type of thing, like sweeping little bits of dirt off things? I'm like, no, I want to hike around and stuff. They're like, well, you should go into geography. So here I am. And then I went on and did, like a master's in geomorphology and started working in the field doing landslide stuff, debris flows, rockfall, that kind of issue, natural hazards, but like natural hazards associated with steep slopes. And then as a result of my work, that wasn't the hard questions. The hard questions were around watershed management and stream flow. And, like, how can we tell if what we've done in this watershed has made a flood larger or smaller than it might otherwise have been? How can we pick up the effects of human or natural alterations of the landscape in a time series of events which don't always occur in a predictable fashion? And so I couldn't answer those questions. So I went back to school while I was still working and did my PhD in forest hydrology, which was, I would have to say, was a really dumb idea. Don't do it that way. Don't try and do two things full time at once. It's just hell. But yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting then. So you started first with geology, or sorry, geography?
Geoscience, yeah, geography.
Geoscience. You started first with geoscience and you saw the real niche for like what people really need to know, like the real interest is mainly hydrology and water management.
Not so much the real interest, but the stuff about landslides, for instance, is a lot simpler to answer. Like, okay, here's a steep slope. We see it's got some cracks in it. We have all these tools like LiDAR and ground penetrating radar and stuff like that, where we can look and say, yeah, a landslide's going to happen here for sure, guaranteed 100%. We don't know quite when, but we know it's going to happen, and you shouldn't build your house under it. That's a simple question. Was the 2021 flood in the Chilliwack River larger or smaller than it would otherwise have been as a result of the amount of roads we've built? That's a hard question. Like we can have our suspicions, but it's a really hard question to answer with scientific rigor. And it was that difficulty that attracted me and had me go back to become a hydrologist, because I wanted to be able to answer some of these more difficult questions.
Yeah, definitely. It's very important, and it's also very challenging work.
Yeah.
That kind of segues into my next question. So I watched your, I guess, kind of lecture. I saw it on YouTube with FVRL in 2022.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And you spoke about the storm disaster and the floods and all that kind of stuff. And I had when I was watching it, my main question was, we kind of see, there's this conception that you spoke about too, that like this happens only once every 10 years, once every 20 years. And
yes,
there's like kind of that trend. But I mean, how can you use data and statistics from the past and kind of leading up till more recently to kind of debunk that kind of, you know, conception that it only happens every 100 years type of thing?
Yeah, so it's I guess the part of the problem is the way people think about these things. So it's really common to speak about, like, say, the 1 in 100-year flood as, and we use that's shorthand for the flood that would occur on average only once in 100 years if the climate was stable. And you should think about that a little bit like the same way if you're rolling dice, for instance. You have a die with 6 sides and you roll it. Like every time you roll it, if it's a fair die, it should come up like 1 in 6. 1 out of every 6 rolls should roll a 6. But if you roll 3 6s in a row, does that mean your die is weighted, you know, that somebody slipped it to you and you're gambling and or not, right? How do you tell? You have to get a larger sample. And so we have that larger sample for lots of streams in the province because we've been recording stream flow for, you know, 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or, and in some cases over 100 years. But the problem is that that's not a steady background. We're changing the climate and that's making things warmer. And so we have to look at not just the trend, but how has the trend changed over time? Like, do we see an increase, a statistically significant increase in the size of these flows or in the duration of these flows over time? And so it comes down to statistics, just the same way that you would deal with dice or you would deal with, you know, medical issues. Like if you're running a double-blind trial and trying to determine, like, say, if smoking causes lung cancer or not. So you can split things up into 2 populations and look at one relative to the other. Climate change is usually a time-sensitive thing, so we can look at, say, if we have 100 years of record, we can look at the first 50 years to the second 50 years and see if they're, you know, different levels, and then we can attribute that to climate change over the time. We can also do, and it's pretty difficult, we can do modeling where essentially we build what should be a physically based model of a particular watershed. And again, with that, once, like, we have inputs for things like, you know, soil depth and rainfall intensity and everything like that. And in these models, they should actually be physically based in that. For instance, if you have a parameter for soil porosity or for slope steepness, it should reflect what's actually out there, like that you've gone out and measured some of these parameters. But ultimately, with one of these models, you build one and then you train it on data from the past until it can pretty much duplicate what you've observed to date. And then you're like, okay, it's predicted what's happened in the past just fine based on inputs like rainfall and climate. And then you say, what's it going to do going forwards? And this is a little bit like weather predicting, you know, like we know what the air pressure is, the, you know, the isobars and stuff like that. So we think, is there going to rain in a week or not? And then based in the past for things, it's pretty unlikely. So there's only a 10% chance of rainfall. With these models, you're trying to do the same thing, but it's more complex. You're trying to predict what's going on, what's going to happen in a stream in the future based on, you know, inputs like snow melt, temperature, rainfall going forwards. And sometimes you train your little model and it runs fine over the previous 80 years, say, and then when you start going into the future, it messes up and it diverges and it goes off and does its own thing. That usually tells you that you haven't twiddled your knobs right. You haven't set the levels. So, you know, something's wrong. And then you reset and get it back to changing some of the parameters, but it's still predicting what's gone on, and you get it to go ahead as well. So, you know, these models are, they can be ridiculously complex, or they can be really simple, and you try and like reduce a bunch of the complexity down to just a few little black boxes and say, this is all going to be good.
So it sounds like it's a lot of interdisciplinary kind of work where you're working with both academics and developers and provincial governments. And using these type of computer programs, do you have to build them yourself usually, or do you usually outsource them?
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is I don't do them at all. The field I'm in it's certainly using science, but it's using faster and cheaper and quicker things to give answers that may not be 100% correct, but are correct enough to deal with. So, you know, if I'm gonna try and predict what the, say, the 1 in 100-year flow is in a little stream off in the distance somewhere, I don't have to build a model from scratch. I can use like a regional analysis with gauges from other areas and try and look at the trend of discharge with area and predict one of those without doing all that modeling. So it's faster and simpler, and it gets my clients an answer that they want. And, you know, what doesn't matter, like in scientific publishing, if you're writing peer-reviewed literature, you want to have something that you do that is like not only repeatable, but people can understand how you got there. And, you know, it would go through peer review and stuff like that. When you're a consultant and you're writing for a client, you're not writing for peer review and for publication. You're writing for, I need an answer now. And so it still matters. You're a professional, and you have professional guidelines. You know, engineers and geoscientists BC have guidelines for professional practice that I'm following. But there could be more uncertainty associated with your answer because you're not going for the, I can document every step of this process. You're going for, this is a good enough answer for my purposes.
Yeah, and it's great that there is guidelines, and more towards the guidelines aspect. I'm wondering, you probably do a lot of ethical and collaborative work with other members, let's call it that, key players. So as scientists,
Yeah.
So as a scientist, what ethical considerations must be taken into account when studying, you know, these sensitive topics, or like, well, when you're trying to develop land in a certain area, or whether you're trying to help the province out? Are there any ethical implications that you have to consider?
Yeah, absolutely there are. I mean, as a you know, a professional geoscientist, you can see my certificate on the wall behind me here. So I've taken a professional oath, you know, that puts paramount, you know, safety of the public, protection of the environment. You know, there's a whole list of these factors, and they, you know, they guide our professional practice. But when it comes down to it, at some points, there can certainly be differences of opinion, differences of a professional opinion, or differences of opinion between, say, scientists and the public. And it's just a matter of being able to discuss those and hopefully come up with something that works with everyone, or if not, at least be able to document why and how you disagree, I guess. But it's the professionality that is the basis there. There's some things where I'm not able to essentially do that, and it's sometimes you run into people that have very entrenched views about things that they're not willing to discuss. In the last couple of years, we've been through a pandemic, and I encountered a person who was convinced that the government was altering their water supply for specific political reasons. And I explained why I thought that was unlikely. And rather than engaging with me, that made them think that I was also part of the conspiracy against them. And I can't really engage with that anymore. I just have to step back and say, okay, that's it, you know. But most of it isn't like that. Most of it is people from different disciplines or areas working together for a goal that we've all agreed upon, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important part as well, is just having that communication. Once communication gets severed from one party or another, then you can't contribute towards a common goal.
Yeah,
and I think that's the outcome.
Some of the projects I've been working on here in Chilliwack involve, you know, like, say, the revitalization of Squala Hope Slough, which is a project, you know, that's being led by the Palalt tribe, so Sham and Squaw First Nations, with input from, the Save Our Squala group, which I actually got involved with as well as a member to offer them hydrological input on. And then it's led to this project that the First Nations are leading, but, there's input from like City of Chilliwack, from the province, from federal DFO, and sport fishermen and stuff like that. Each of these groups is coming with a different perspective and with different goals and outcomes involved in the process. And so it's like, as a scientist, how can I provide my input and without kind of trying to privilege one of those over another to get to the end goal that we all want, right?
I think that kind of like segues into like what we wanted to ask next, which is more so about policy, like, and policy making in regards to like keeping the environment, I guess sustainable. So what role do you believe policymakers should play in addressing impacts of climate change on hydrology? And is there a specific policy that if it were to be made, or you kind of want it to be made, that you would advocate for to kind of push through and make it a better place, I guess, environmentally to live?
So I'm going to talk in general, and then I have a very, very specific example, or maybe two specific examples. So in general, like, science can inform policy, but science can't set policy, because policymakers have to incorporate not only science, they have to incorporate, social and economic and political factors as well that are outside the domain of science. I can tell you how big the flood in a stream that might occur under climate change to 2100 can be, but whether the size that legislation requires people to build their culverts to pass is a policy question. And knowing what the 1 in 200 year flood is only part of that. They have to balance other factors as well that I don't. So generally, I can, provide numbers and make recommendations based on existing legislation, like, to meet this legislation, this is what you need to do. But to set the legislation to be different is kind of a policy suggestion that's out me. But that said, there's times when I see existing policies that don't work very well. And those are ones where I can provide input based on what I've observed isn't working. And disaster recovery is one of those. So, like in the atmospheric river we had in 2021, for instance, we had a lot of infrastructure damage. We had, culverts or bridges that were too small for the flood flows that we experienced getting washed out or washed away or damaged in one way or another. And there's a specific piece of policy that applies to that. So right now, if you have, say a bridge which is destroyed by a flood, you can apply to higher levels of government, say for disaster financial assistance, which is there to help rebuild. So it's basically like a pool of government money that's set up as in addition to insurance to help speed recovery. But there's a problem, and the problem is that in many cases, because the climate has changed, the structure that failed was properly sized for past climates, but it's undersized for current climate, let alone for future climates. But in the disaster financial assistance, they won't fund for rebuilding a structure larger than the structure was destroyed. They'll only fund rebuilding exactly the same thing that was there beforehand. And there's good and bad things to that, in that it encourages the local governments or government branches which spend money on that infrastructure. It's their responsibility to ensure that it's upsized. But on the other hand, I've seen things where it's known to be undersized and over its design lifespan, and yet it's only paid to rebuild at exactly the same size, which is just like a guarantee that it's going to fail again in the future. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I understand the policy of trying to encourage the responsible agencies to spend their money on it ahead of time instead of waiting to fail in a disaster and then spending someone else's money to have it rebuilt. But at the same time, rebuilding it exactly the same size is just guaranteeing it's going to fail again. And so it's not a good solution. So yeah, that's a policy one where I'd like to see some changes. Another one, and also related to disasters, relates to not so much to hydrology in particular, but to past development with people's houses. There are people right now in the Fraser Valley who are living in areas where development was allowed to proceed in the past under previous legislation. And under current legislation, the same development would not be allowed to proceed because we know those areas are unsafe now. And some of the people that are living in these areas are essentially trapped there because they're living in these areas that are unsafe to live in right now. They're too high. They could be flooded. There could be a landslide that could hill their house. Rocks could fall and completely destroy their house. But their life savings is essentially in that property. They can't sell because it's so unsafe, no one will buy, but they can't leave because they can't get access to any sort of money to let them move away somewhere else. Their money is tied up in property that is essentially valueless now. And it's really tough. Like, it breaks my heart dealing with these people, and I have to do it frequently because quite often I'm the one that's coming in and identifying that, yeah, it's where you live now is unsafe. I can't solve the problem. I can't I can say, you need to leave now because if you live in this house for, say, in the next 10 years, it's likely that you'll die at some point in there when a landslide hits your house. I can give them that information, but I can't buy them a new house and send them out, right? But government is not willing to spend the full price of the house, like their assessed value. They are willing to give you a portion of that. And a portion is better than nothing, because when that landslide happens, it's going to be worth big old zero. But it's that hump to get over where even with the amount that government's willing to pay, if they're willing to pay, it's still not enough for them to afford to move away. And so it's a real catch-22. And I really hate it because, like, these people bought their property in good faith. They believed it was safe at the time they bought it. You know, things have changed. We have more information. We understand now that it's unsafe, but it still doesn't get them out of their hole knowing how it happened, right? And so, like, what do you do? You know, we need, and some of these areas may even have been safe under previous climates, but they're not safe under the current climate, and they're a lot less safe under climate going forward.
So my last question would be, if you had to debunk some flim-flam about science of hydrology, what would it be?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a hard one to answer. We've already talked about the idea, you know, because people do think, you know, when you say the 1 in 100-year flood, they think it means it's the flood that happens every once in 100 years, and it happened last year. So I got 100 years until it happens again. I'm safe. Whereas, yeah, you know, obviously it's something that could happen at any one time. But, you know, most people kind of have a little idea of how that works. But there's some other ones. The one that I think is a hydrologic one that really gets me is, and it's not that it's bad, it's just like a misconception. When you talk about groundwater in particular, a lot of people seem to think that groundwater is like an actual underground river that's flowing from place to place like it's in a pipe. Like, I ran into a lady on Salt Spring Island that was really sure the water in her well came from Mount Baker, and it was going under the Salish Sea and coming up in her well somehow. And I was trying to explain, you know, that's actually not how it works. And it was just like it was we couldn't make our descriptions mesh. She was sure that this water was just like flowing underneath and out, you know.
And I've run under the house.
Yeah, like, I've had other people that have had the same idea, like, you know, like, I run into people that use dowsing to try and find groundwater. You know, they've got these little metal things and they think they're going to cross. And I mean, those things are fun to play around with. Don't get me wrong. When I was a kid, my mom gave me 2 rods and said, look, these will cross over water. Go and play with them, you know, and then I'm gone for 2 hours testing them out. But scientifically, that stuff doesn't work. And it's always interesting to me when I come across people that still think it does, because I'm like, okay, so you're going to find the pipe for me. Go and find it. And then they find it. And where they find it is usually nowhere near where the pipe actually is, but it's this unassailable belief that it works. And I don't know why.
Yeah. Well, that I'm not gonna lie, before I took science in university, I thought that's how it worked. So
Yeah.
thanks for debunking it. I'll go tell everyone I know. Well, I just want to thank you. Well, we all want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I really enjoyed talking to you. But yeah, no, thank you so much for meeting with us. And
Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm really glad to have met you guys, you know? So yeah, I'll go now.
Okay, that was a great interview. I really liked what he said all around, like every topic. But I have to say the question I asked regarding like the trends we see in climate change and how we can use data and stats to kind of predict or kind of debunk that you know, oh, it only happens every 10 years kind of thing. So I like that he pointed out that we obviously compare data within the past like 50 years or whatever, past 100 years, and that's how we can predict the trends. But these are all based on like these building models based on the physical parameters of the area at that time. So the soil depth, the rainfall, the snow cap, like if it's near a cliff, if it's near like all that kind of stuff. I really liked his answer in regards to how things are changing now and how climate change is affecting all of that. And so we aren't able to use the data that we were back then to kind of predict what's happening now to a T. We do need to kind of alter it and use different models, make new models to predict new future conditions. And we need to, you know, go off of new parameters. We can't just think about the parameters from 50 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The climate is currently always changing. And although we got the statistic of maybe, oh, it happens once in 100 years, not every year is the same. Not every year you'll have the same amount of rainfall. And it's all, you can't just make an average out of it. And so I think that with technology advancing and progressing, it's really important that we have these multidisciplinary collaborative efforts to try and use maybe computerized models to increase that precision and accuracy for prediction. I mean, that's something that I really enjoyed about what he said as well, is that, you know, this multidisciplinary nature of it. These models are outsourced to computer scientists and programmers who don't actually work within his consulting company, but he still works with them. And they create three-dimensional simulations, basically, with adjustable physical parameters like rainfall, for example.
That was really cool. When he was talking about that, that was really
exactly.
cool.
And it allows you to predict future geological developments with greater accuracy.
Yeah, so I think that for that it's basically instead of building complex models from scratch, just using the regional analysis with existing data works better. More so, I think it's just like creating a balance between the accuracy and the practicality.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
well said, most definitely. And I also like the idea of the fact that at the end of the day, the what you're predicting is actually able to like truly impact other people, because if you're able to like use actual previous data into a model that can predict something for the future, and that's just a way to like help people, I believe.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, talk about helping people. One of the things that really stood out to me was when he said about how some land currently, when it was like before it was bought, it was considered a good place to build and develop. But as the years go by, now it's become unsafe. And these people, their price of their houses are devaluating by the year. And that's a real struggle.
Yes, and like it's not even their fault. Like I totally agree with how he's saying that the government should do better, because at the end, it's not the residents' fault that that's happening. It's just the environment and the trend lines that are just occurring.
Yeah, it's also
Absolutely.
like an unfortunate event of changing legislations. Also, like with different legislation coming and going, different rules are set in place, and some rules really do screw people over. And those people who are screwed over, I truly feel sorry for them because at this point now they're living in a house where that's pretty much valueless. They're unable to sell it, and they're unable to like move away because like their monetary asset is tied into that valueless property.
Yeah, this is one of those times where there's a little bit of friction in between the balance of like science and politics. And that's one of the, one of the not difficulties, but challenges of being able to work in those multidisciplinary settings.
Yeah, I think that when he talked about in the beginning, he was talking about how like he hit home for us because in the Fraser Valley we did have that huge flood a couple years ago, and
Right.
he did touch on like the policies behind that. It was like they had to rebuild the infrastructure, and there's so much to be done that maybe like the policymakers didn't take into account at the time. And then you'd think now that, oh, because the Fraser Valley has been through something like that, they would put more policies in place. But he did say that, the one of the policies he would want to be put in place would have something to do with that, with infrastructure in general, just because there's no fallback for these people who lose their houses or lose their farms or lose like their community in that kind of situation.
I believe one
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
biggest, yeah, I believe one of the biggest topics that was brought up was like the ditch or like fixing the ditches around the Sumas Prairie.
Yeah.
And the thing about that is that the current legislation says, okay, well, the I think it was the federal government will give you money for fixing what was broken, but if what was broken was, not working in the first place, you need to build something better. And the fact that they won't give you the money to build something better or even the amount to to cover the base, because it's not what you're doing, you want to build something better. It's kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I also like agreed with him most when he said that because that was an example of one of the legislation that he thinks isn't working, and I totally agree with that because like the disaster recovery legislation, it's really bad. It doesn't really help as much as when a disaster is like overcame, you're
Yeah.
building the same structure to pretty much that is gonna get destroyed again instead of something that is able to withstand a future disaster that's gonna come.
Yeah, I same thing as Sebastian. I feel like just just them just getting the budget to make same to use the same material, the same everything. Again, I think that's just something that they need to work on, and a policy and science should actually just work hand in hand together to make things better, not just to improvise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, even if you ask like, well, we need the money to replace this. Could you give us the money that it costs to build the replacement, but we'll provide the little extra so we can make it that much better? Because
Exactly.
you do not
Right.
want to build something that is built to fail.
That's exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also was thinking about with that whole disaster, I should have asked him in that moment how he would have thought it would have affected like the indigenous as like because when you take into like ethical implications making policies, sometimes it kind of steps like it kind of oversteps with like indigenous beliefs of the land. So I feel like I don't know, do you guys have any thoughts on that? Like on that aspect, like in making policies but keeping that ethical kind of implication, kind of getting rid of that implication?
It's definitely important to keep cultural perspectives when making policy, and it's what makes it challenging, but also very rewarding when you have multiple disciplines of people from politics, from all different types of disciplines in science, and from different kinds of culture, particularly for First Nations and indigenous cultures. Um, and when you make it work, that can be a very beautiful thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
most definitely. I do believe it's something that should be respected first of all. The culture belief shouldn't be something that, should be stepped upon. They have different culture beliefs in place, and I think they should also be incorporated with certain policies that are set.
I really liked how Dr. Brayshaw like communicates and feels for everyone. Like he does want a cultural aspect to it, but he also wants to respect and answer all of the residents' problems, even though there's like misconceptions that he was talking about in hydrology. Like, for example, when he was tackled that with the idea that the groundwater flows like underground rivers, and that he actually told the resident that it actually just moves slowly through porous soil and rock. But just him thinking that, oh, like these questions are so like people should know, but he does at the end just answer them rather than just like ignoring questions of like just residents or like the community.
You bring up a
I like
really
that about him as well. I thought that he was very thoughtful when it came to that as well.
you bring up a really good point, because part of it is having that equity and just that equity of information, that dissemination to the general public so that they're more aware about their environment and like the kind of purchases they're doing, or like what lands they should purchase, how they should prepare. That is also equity in science.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also feel like this topic kind of pushes for more community engagement into helping those who may not have access to such sciences, for instance.
Yep, absolutely.
Anyone else have anything that stood out to them?
Yeah, I really like the 1 in 100 year flood, explaining that means a 1% chance in occurring in any given year. I like how he explained that with the sample sizes and how, again, the data and the trends actually matter. And does it mean that if it happens, if it has already happened, it won't happen again?
Yeah. To be honest, when like that whole section, because I think we asked him like, what is something that you would debunk, that people like, a belief you would debunk or whatever. I kind of was like thinking the groundwater, like the whole aspect of, it just moves through, it just moves and you just like stick a hole in there and the water comes out. Like for a long time, I did think it was that. Am I alone on that?
No, don't get like me too. I'm on it.
No, honestly, yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, there's just water under there, but it's not, apparently it's not. So
Yeah, and I think that figure, sometimes statistics can be a little misleading. I mean, 1 in 100 doesn't mean just because it happened today, it'll happen in 100 years. It means that just because it happens today, in 25 years, there'll be a 25% chance it will happen that year.
Right.
And that's still substantial.
yeah, exactly.
I think Josh said it best with like that summarizing sentence. He said that science advises policy. Science should not make policy, because
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is a multi-disciplinary effort.
Yeah, when you said that, I was really like, that's like the perfect way to put it. Science can inform policy, but cannot set it. Policymakers must balance scientific, social, economic, and political factors when making these decisions. So
That's exactly it. All right, so it's been amazing to hear about Dr. Drewbrayshaw's journey and gain insights into the complexities and challenges of hydrology. His dedication to ethical practice, the importance of informed policy, and his efforts to debunk common misconceptions are truly inspiring. We would like to thank Dr. Drewbrayshaw for sharing his expertise and passion with us. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to our inaugural podcast. We hope today's episode has provided valuable perspectives on the critical role of hydrology in understanding and addressing climate change. Stay curious, stay informed, and join us next time for more engaging conversations with leading experts in the field. Until then, take care and keep exploring the wonders of science.